I'm very honored to be able to speak to you again, speak to this crowd again. I had the good fortune to address this audience last year, and therefore it is good to be back. I also like to thank the ambassador of Japan in Lisbon for his kind introductory remarks. We met each other online just several months ago. So again, it's a pleasure to be able to see you again. Also would like to thank the very large audience, nearly 70. I also see many fellow REPA members who are attending. So either you either had an early supper or you're going to have a late supper, but thank you for joining. I'm particularly pleased to see many former and active Japanese military officers who are in our audience today. So I think this will really add to what I have to say in the Q&A discussion. It also shows you the interest that the Japanese military possesses in the issue that I'm about to speak to you today. Without further ado, I'd like to jump in. Of course, the standard caveat applies. That is, I do not represent any particular organization. I represent myself only. I do not toe the official Japanese line. I cannot toe the official Japanese line. Therefore, I'm sure that what I say will diverge a lot from what Japan's official policy currently stands. And so let me just go into my slides. And you are seeing my slides, correct? And it should be a steadily changing world.
Not yet.
Is that what you're
Not
all
yet,
seeing?
Tosh.
Not yet?
Not yet.
Oh, you don't see my slides? Okay.
No.
I'm seeing my slides. So let me, that is interesting.
Share it.
Okay. Yeah, I thought I did that already. Let me do it one more time. Okay, so
Yeah.
is it now? Are you now seeing my slides?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, let me try to get this out of the way. Okay. Okay, and then. Okay, so so a steadily changing world. Just a few slides. So I'm a historian by training. I think I tend to see things more from a longer term or a macro perspective than most political science do. I mean, I think that history has many lessons to teach us. And one of the things that you definitely need to acknowledge, I think, is that, first of all, the world order is never static. I mean, when I was a college student, I really enjoyed my geology classes, and it really ingrained upon me how our notion of time is really depending on our biological time, whereas geological time is much, much longer. And because of the time difference, of geologic time versus our biological human time, you don't really notice the difference of the changes that take place on our planet. I think the dimension of time is much shorter when it comes to nation states or international relations, but yet it is still longer than our biological lives. And therefore, we may not necessarily pick up on the changes that are taking place. But I believe that changes do take place. And if you look back in history, if you take a decade at a time, you really notice in hindsight the changes that have occurred. But when you look at the Pax, I like to talk about Spain and Portugal together as the Pax Non-Bon period. It's a terminology that I coined. But I mean, Pax Non-Bon is long gone. Pax Britannica has definitely faded. And one of the things to keep in note is that when Spain was at its apex, Britain was at its zenith, it did not really realize the moment where the decline starts. You have British diplomats in the early 1920s talking about how the empire will continue. And when you realize that their empire was already in a stage of decline. And I think in a similar vein, Pax Americana is in a phase where it's being increasingly challenged. I still realize that the United States is by far the most powerful nation, but I'm speaking in relative terms. America is no longer the America of the 1950s, where it was what, 80% of the global economy. That's not the case now. And we are now living in an increasingly unstable period in history where China has emerged as the clear challenger to the US-led liberal international order. And of course, this liberal international order is the post-World War II order with the United States at the center. And as we speak, I think global lines are gradually being drawn based on values and ideology. But these are much less distinct than the Cold War. And apologies for all the typos, because it was a busy day today. So please just decipher what I have here. But then the reason why these global lines are less distinct is because we're all linked to China. You know, it's not during the Cold War where you had the Iron Curtain. There was very limited trade, if any. No, this is not it. We're all linked. And therefore, because of this link, I think it's harder to see how these fissures are slowly emerging. But I think as the Biden administration continues, and right now, the thing that I'm following is how the Biden administration is pressuring Moscow. This, I believe, will bring together China and Russia together. They'll work out their differences and better align their national interests. Last year, Putin made a comment that he wouldn't mind having an alliance with China. Now, these are two countries that were not necessarily on the same page, weren't necessarily seeing eye to eye, yet they increasingly see the United States as the nemesis, as the obstacle for their pursuit of national interests. And therefore, they'll start to grow closer and closer. Again, this has a historical analogy, and I like to compare it with Germany and Japan, which had never been, again, on the same page. They were never that friendly. Mind you that Japan and Germany were enemies during World War I. And of course, China and Russia had their conflict as well. But it was the international order established by Britain and the United States, which posed a challenge. I mean, they realized, Germany and Japan realized that under the established order, they could never pursue their national interests, that the existing hegemons created an order that suited their interests and not necessarily the interests of the up and coming. So I do think that there are a lot of parallels with history, 1930s history. Europe has remained aloof to this challenge. And today I am particularly pleased that I'm giving this talk to to a group from Portugal mostly, because I believe, Portugal is very fortunate in its geostrategic position, at least now. You have the Atlantic Ocean on one side, on the other side, you have Spain. So, and you're far away from, Russia, also far away from China. And so I think that there is this strategic security through insulation. And therefore, when you look at Europe, I think perhaps Portugal is perhaps not yet as keen to realize the challenges that China poses. Other countries have changed. I think most notable was Germany. Of course, when you look at other countries other than Europe, Australia also had a volte-face, but Germany's volte-face was quite stunning. It was very clear that Merkel decided at one point that Germany's fate will be, or Germany's economic interests would be with holding China's hands, but that has sort of really changed. I remember when I was in Denmark, I think this was in either 2008 or 2009, and I gave a talk about how China will be the future threat. And I remember the audience that didn't really buy my argument. And they felt that, no, there's nothing. China is peaceful rise, that China can't be a threat. But a little more than a decade has elapsed, and I think most people do see China as the number one adversary to our values. Japan, interestingly, has gone the other way during early 2010s, especially 2012, when the Japanese government took possession of the Senkaku Islands, really felt the wrath of China, and the anti-Japanese sentiment was rife in China itself, and that's when Japan started to see China as a threat. But ever since then, it seems like Japan and Europe are sort of like crossing and they're going the other way, where Japan sees its economic future tied with China. That prosperity is with China, whereas a lot of European countries are a lot more wary about this. So, I mean, Japan is right now in a position where it's torn between its economic interests and security interests. And it seems to be lots of people are advocating a policy of taking the middle road, that it's the most enticing. Now, the big question that I have is this middle road policy, is it something that's sustainable? Is it something that solves problems? So with that in mind, let's look at the two main protagonists. We have China on one side and then the United States on the other. I think it's important that we observe and are keen to the sources of Chinese conduct. Why is China doing what it's doing? What drives China? And of course, I'm not going to do justice to this very question by giving a very, very brief answer. But let me take a step. And I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is historical memory in China is one of victimization. That it really got the short end of the stick when it came to imperialism. It was the 99-year leases and whatnot, taking away of its sovereignty. And I think that insecurity still exists. And this is one of the reasons why China wants to push out. But it's not just about the history of insecurity. It's also immensely part of its history. After all, it was the Middle Kingdom. Especially during periods of Han rule, and China saw itself as the world. And so you have this element of being proud of your past. And especially, after more than a quarter century of rapid growth, as you all know, after Tiananmen, you had the economic sanctions, and once those started to become lifted, it's been about 25 years. China has had immense economic growth, and now it sees itself as a great power. Now, there are a lot of ways you can define a great power, but I think one definition is that a great power tries to establish global norms and also influence the world order to suit its interests, right? And so, and no Chinese now use the rhetoric of peaceful rights, right? Because that stage is in the past. And we all know that there are no rises that are peaceful, because every time any nation rises, and it's a large nation, that there are adjustments that need to be made on the global stage. Now, what has changed from last year is, of course, the COVID. I think in many ways this has impacted international relations, and I think this is something that we'll probably need to study in depth once we pulled out of this pandemic. And one of the things that I sense from observing Chinese and speaking with Chinese is that COVID has proved to them that their system is superior, that democracy is weak, can't even save its own people, that it's feeble, right? And you just look at the casualty rates of democracies such as the United States, Brazil, India, and then compare it with China and some of these other authoritarian states. Yeah, there is a stark difference. And China also believes that because of what's happening, so first of all, you have this element of confidence, and it's evident, and it's also this mentality of being superior. But you also realize the West is reeling from the pandemic, and this is a prime time for China to further expand the sphere of influence. China will grow. It's growing what, 6-7%, and it's only a matter of time that it will surpass the United States in several key economic indices. At this point, last time I checked, it was nearly 70% of US GDP. In 1940, the challengers, Germany and Japan, when you look at their GDP in 1940s and combine it, it's still about half the United States. So you can see that China alone surpasses Germany and Japan in the 1930s. That being said, China is also a peaking power. I know its population is not only shrinking, it's an aging society. And I think it's just, it will, from 2030s on, you'll start to see the gradual decline of China. So what does that mean? Well, that means that time is not on the side of China, that it needs to act now. It's again very similar to countries such as Japan and China in the pre-war period, where time only benefited the United States, and therefore the status quo had to be changed sooner rather than later. And finally, we need to understand the enormous ambitions of Xi Jinping. He's a dictator. He is not a democratically elected leader. He will be in power as long as he can be. And he also has a very, very strong sense that he wants to be the greatest leader that communist China has created. In order to do that, he needs to surpass Mao. And the only way I see that can be done is for him to finish the job that Mao failed to do, and that is to take Taiwan. And once he takes Taiwan, I believe that he feels that he can seal his name as the greatest leader ever. I mean, combine Mao and Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Jinping would be see himself as being much more successful in contributing to the legacy of China. Okay, so the other protagonist, the United States, and this is why I believe that there's turbulence in the horizon, is that, well, my point is that the United States will definitely act in the end. Now, the United States is traditionally very slow to react to global strategic threats. Just take the Cold War. The British were much quicker in realizing the Soviet threat, right? But once Truman got his head around to the fact that, the Soviets are not your friend, and they were ready to take on this challenge. Truman shifted positions, and Eisenhower continued that. And I think the United States will eventually be similar in this century, and realize. People already have realized the Chinese threat. I guess now it's a matter of how to act, so that you start to see changes. And one of the changes that you already see is the rhetoric. The United States used to label China as an unfair player, and this mostly was related to the area of trade and technology. But most recently, it's been an adversary. But of course, an adversary, it's honorable to have compromise. It's honorable to shake hands and strike a deal, right? But I believe this United States view of China will not stop at an adversary, and it will take the next step, and soon you'll start seeing rhetoric such as evil. We saw it with the evil empire, the axis of evil, and also the word enemy or foe may start popping up. And with these two terms, compromise is a weakness. It's not a noble thing to do. But as it now stands, and when I gave the talk last year, and this is a big difference between my talk last year and this year, is that the Trump was president when I addressed this crowd, and this year it's Biden. So American policy has changed. One of the changes that you see right away is that the Biden administration is much more values alliances, much more, and it's sort of trying to create this scrum against China. But that being said, the United States itself is not unified in its policy towards China. What you have is, I see, as a mixed bag of cooperation, especially when it comes to climate change. And of course, you have a healthy doses of competition, technology, trade. But also there's the element of confrontation, South China Sea, Uyghurs, whatnot. But these are all rolled up. And so when I look at the Biden administration, it has, let's say it has two sets of wheels. One is the security dimension, led by Blinken and Austin, and the other side is the climate change wheel, and this is led by former Vice President Kelly. To me, it seems like the climate change wheel is much larger, and so the torque has a lot more torque. So even though the United States believes that it's heading in a straight trajectory, it's sort of being pulled or veers off more to the climate change, and that means cooperation. It takes dominance over confrontation. So that's one of the things that sort of I think that we need to follow because Kelly has made it very clear that he doesn't care about other issues. For him, his mission is to deal with climate change. That's what he's going to do. And so, you wonder what are the priorities here. I mean, you have cooperation, competition, confrontation. In which order does the United States pursue this? But I also believe that as time progresses, the global order will become increasingly unstable, and the likelihood of stumbling into a major conflict will rise. And this is, I've always said this. I said the same thing last year, and this hasn't changed. But the danger, I think, has increased in the fact that when you listen to Chinese rhetoric, because they believe democracy is weak, they believe that their system is much more superior, that there's an element of underestimating American resolve and capabilities. And this is always very dangerous because it, in a very subtle way, and sometimes not so subtle ways, it affects decision-making. And when you think your opponent is weak, it can be pushed around, and that reflects itself in policy, either consciously or subconsciously. And therefore, there could be a misstep or a miscalculation by China. Now, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is, and this is more towards my Japanese audience, is that one of the popular words to throw around now is New Cold War. But I think the New Cold War is misleading because it really was not cold in Asia. You had the Korean War, you had Vietnam War, you had these proxy wars, regional wars. And so, that could happen in Asia again. You could have a regional war. And hopefully it won't escalate into a global war, but you can't rule that out either. And ultimately, the United States will need to depend on its allies. Again, it's not just about America going it alone anymore, but I am very, very confident that ultimately the United States will prevail. And, laugh at me, call me an optimist. It's just that I have this deep sense that, ultimately, because the United States has allies in which they share values, and it's not going alone, that in the end it will persevere. And ironically, Biden talked about, healing America's division, healing America's wounds. That's easier said than done. And ultimately, I think it's the existence of China that will actually heal America's divisions and make America a lot stronger. In the end, it's Americans that can only destroy America. And under Trump, that was actually starting to take place. It was starting to manifest itself. Yes, especially on January 6th, that was clear, evident for everybody to see. But it is China, the emergence of China, is what will really bring America together. I guess the analogy in my mind is the Spanish-American War of 1898, where America was really torn by the Civil War until that point. But the moment, the War of Spain, it was a short but decisive war. America came together. So now that is the ironic aspect of this China threat. Okay, so how does Japan need to respond? And it's about more than being a middle power. It still has a very strong appeal for lots of Japanese. And I don't understand this middle power mindset. I guess middle power refer to a country such as Australia or Canada, but when you look at Japan's capabilities, not just population, its economy, also its military capabilities, it's more than a middle power, right? But it seems to be Japan's pursuing this course of being a middle power and taking the middle road. So it's the double middle, which I think is not a position that Japan should take. So what does it need to do in the short term to not be a middle power? Well, first of all, the easy stuff is just like social distancing is necessary now with COVID. Nation distancing. Japan needs to decouple. Biden signed an executive order in February for the United States to decouple. You're not really seeing the same pressure to Japan to do the same. For most Japanese businesses, it's business as usual. I'm buying cotton from Xinjiang. Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's fine cotton. Now, plus, China gives us profits. I mean, is that really the course that the prudent course to pursue? Because China has leverage over you. So I think Japan needs to reduce its economic exposure, needs to create more free trade links with other regions, other countries. And in that sense, I think Japan and EU is win-win when it comes to the free trade agreement. Bolstering its military presence in the Senkaku is necessary. Increasing defense spending, of course, is a must. I mean, Japan is spending less as a percentage of GDP on defense than South Korea is. It's spending, and if Japan were a country in the EU or in NATO, Japan would be getting a lot of flack because it's 0.9% of GDP. And that's amazing considering what's happening to the global politics that Japan is only spending 0.9% of its GDP. So right now it's 5.3 trillion Japanese yen. And that is just, and a lot of that goes into, salaries, benefits, and whatnot, so it's really, really not enough. But the level of discourse when it comes to defense issues, right? I mean, the Japanese are seriously debating, is it necessary to, or is it okay to possess striking capability? I mean, is it all right to hit your enemy? Because the guiding principle for Japan for a long time has been, it's called senshiboi in Japanese. And just the other day, I was having dinner with some former generals, and I was saying, whatever you can't translate into English from the Japanese word, it usually doesn't have any meaning. And I think senshiboi is one of those. And it roughly translated, it means exclusive defense. That Japan's military posture will be exclusively defense. And that's sort of been the guiding principle. But, defense is not enough. Sometimes it's offense that's the best defense, right? Right now, Japanese military bases, I mean, can you really defend these airstrips, ports from Chinese attack, especially from the air? That's very difficult to do. And so what you need capability in which you can hurt your enemy. Now, this I think, is the true nature of deterrence. It makes them think twice before they hit you. But Japan really is lacking in there. So again, in order to do this, you need to not only spend more, you need to change the mindset of your own people. And that I guess is the midterm part. I think Japan needs to support a maritime ASEAN. To me, the countries that are important are Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. I mean, it's not just the first island chain, but it's the first island chain that sort of wraps around at the bottom. These are all large countries. These are countries that have a vested interest in maintaining free and open the oceans, the sea lanes. And I also believe that Japan needs to work more to create the ROK-ROC triangle. It's very hard for Japan to approach Taiwan, at least on the surface. You got to tread with caution there, but I think a lot could be done under the surface. And with Korea, Korea is, there's lots of resentment in Japan towards Korea, but they have elections next year, and the Philippines too, elections next year. So I think 2022 could be a moment where things start to change. And Quad, which is, I think, same bed, different dreams, this empty vessel kind of thing, could start to take more meaning. And that goes to my fifth point here about Quad giving more substance, and FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy. I mean, it's supposed to be a strategy, but for Japan, it's called a concept. Again, something was lost in translation because concept and strategy are not the same, because a strategy is aimed at somebody. And this is where Japan is trying to sort of, take the middle road. It's like, oh, we don't want to offend China. We don't want to alienate China. Also, Japan needs to ensure that the U.S. remains committed to the region. And the only way for Japan to do this is to be a more proactive partner. And it's not about, oh, okay, America, how much more money do you want? It's like, America, what can we do? Let's think together, and we're on the same team here. This kind of attitude, which I think is necessary. And also, Japan needs something more with Europe. And I think the post-London Declaration NATO is a different NATO. And of course, Dr. Tomei can probably elaborate more on that. But Quad is never going to be NATO, and there's not going to be a NATO of Asia from scratch. So why not link the two? Is what I'm thinking. Japan should be able to do more to not just exchange intelligence and ideas, but also to sort of be more aligned with NATO. One of the things that I would suggest is, NATO has its own standards when it comes to munitions and armaments. Japan should probably adhere more to those same standards. Now, I digress. Let's move back to the slide. So the midterm. And these are things that are very difficult to do, but yet Japan cannot avoid. And they must strive to achieve this. And one is to restore Japan's security identity. The Japanese have to realize that peace is not like air. It should not be taken for granted. That defending like-minded nations, your neighbors, is critically important, right? It's not just about being protected by the United States. This is what I call a security receiver mentality, but to be also a security provider. No, I'm not advocating Japan to send troops to the Middle East or no, but at least in your region, in your surrounding a neighborhood, that Japan can act as a nation that could provide security. As it now stands, Japan can't do that. Why? Because of Article 9. And so I, really believe that revising Article 9 is the key piece which will assure Japan to be a nation that maintains peace and its own safety. Now, Japan did revise its security laws, but revising security laws is so different than revising your constitution, because revising security laws is, I think, a legal approach. It allows you to do, perhaps a lot more than what you could do in the past. Yet there are limits because you haven't changed the sentiment of the public. A constitution is what constitutes you as a nation, and only by changing that is what can really change a security identity of the people. And so there's no, a way of avoiding this. And the more Japan kicks the can down, I think, a worse predicament it will find itself when a conflict does break out. And finally, ensuring Japan's global relevancy. And again, I don't mean to offend any Portuguese, but I mean, we all know that global relevancy is not, it's not static. I mean, Portugal during its prime was a lot more influential nation, right? Japan too. I mean, if it could see itself as, to the level of the Netherlands or even maybe less, right? Nothing is assured. You have to strive to make your nation prosper. And I just don't see Japanese politicians really addressing this. It goes back to my opening about the differences in the notion of time, right? Politicians, their view of time is to the next elections, but where it should be more about the future of the nation, which is long-term. And therefore mitigating the aging society, the low birth rate. I mean, Japan's birth rate has shrunk for 40 years in a row. And when there's a site, it's very interesting, it's a website where it shows the demographics per age of all the major nations in the world, right? And so you have these African nations, beautiful pyramid shape. Even the United States, it's not a perfect pyramid, but the bottom part of the triangle is larger than the top part. Japan is like an inverted pyramid. So you have a much smaller group supporting a very, very large elderly population. I mean, how is that sustainable? And it really isn't. And another thing is that I call it silver democracy. Japanese youths, 18 and above, 18 to 30, can all vote but yet they won't mean anything because the elderly population outnumber them 2-1. So if you're a politician, you can pretty much, say, oh, I'm going to disregard you. The young people, you guys don't count because, you're totally outnumbered. So again, maybe that's one of the problems with democracy. It's all about numbers. Okay, so Japan-Europe relations. And this is where I'd like to get your feedback, because I was sort of pulling my hair out, say, okay, how can Japan strengthen its strategic links with Europe? And it's really, I really would like to get feedback from my fellow European colleagues about this. One of the things is that we throw around the term Europe, but the Europe is not the United States of Europe. You have distinct countries, you have distinct people, and we have 27 EU nations, so that means probably 27 paths of pursuing national interests. And therefore, I do not believe that it's realistic for Japan to pursue relations or strategic relations with all European nations at the same level, right? That's just too much. Just the other day, I was speaking to a very senior diplomat, and he was telling me, well, Portugal was on one end and you got the Baltics on the other. So of course we see things differently. And I think it's a very important point. So what does Japan need to do? It needs to strengthen links with countries that have a vested interest in the Indo-Pacific, and also with a maritime presence. And also, size matters in this case, and it's the economy. It's your economic viability, it's your economic prowess that gives you national strength. And so, from my perspective, and again, I'm not trying to lessen the importance of other European countries, but from a Japanese perspective, it would definitely be United Kingdom, France, and Germany. And if there's going to be a second tier, we'll probably like countries like Netherlands. And these are countries that will be sending a maritime presence to Japan, either aircraft carrier, frigate, whatnot. Of course, we all know this is symbolic. It's a very expensive endeavor to send out ships all the way out here. Britain is no longer the Britain under Thatcher. I really doubt the United Kingdom could pull off a war in the Falklands again, considering those distances. I believe the British Navy is that back then it was still the Cold War, so we had a formidable Royal Navy. Right now, I think with all these budget cuts, that's not necessarily the case. But nevertheless, UK is especially critical because among the European nation, it does have the largest naval presence. And I also personally believe the Baltics are important because of their keen sense of threat perception, because of their history with Russia, of being occupied by Russia, and the fact that they share a border with Russia. And this is very different than other European countries that are more insulated. For example, a country like Switzerland, what's their threat, right? So, and so countries that have lost their independence, have lost their freedom, and have still faced a real threat, I think can really, really give Japan lessons as to how to pursue national survival. So with that in mind, this is definitely less about the messy EU. 27 assorted flavors, right? And it's more about the individual European countries. That being said, I think the key facet will be to link more with NATO. NATO is key, and I know there's cooperation intelligence and cyberspace and also outer space. But can there be more done? Can we do more in areas of weapons development, procurements, whatnot? And this is where I realize when I speak to my fellow friends in the military, it's very difficult. The Japanese structure of its military is so embedded in buying stuff from the United States that you can't just change course. It's not like ANA or Japan Airlines saying, okay, we're sick and tired of buying Boeing because they don't give us discounts. We have to pay more because they realize we're only going to buy from them. So therefore, we're going to go to Airbus. That's much easier than the Japanese government saying, or the Japanese military saying, okay, we're also going to buy fighters, and we're also going to buy tanks, and we're also going to, actually Japan doesn't buy tanks. So, other military equipment from bombers, whatever, from Europe. It just doesn't work that way because the support system, I mean, the tools, everything is different, right? So it's a problem. And I think, but I think you have to start somewhere. So maybe we can start with small projects, bring together experts and have them talk and figure out a way in which Japan and Europe can, source together. And this is just an idea that I throw out. What's going to happen in Europe in the coming years is, China has already done a splendid job of splitting up ASEAN, right? There is no ASEAN unity, at least from my perspective. And perhaps it will strive to do the same in Europe. Greece, Hungary, you got also the non-EU countries such as Serbia. I mean, China's in there, its tentacles are everywhere. And so I think increasingly creating a common front will be difficult. And hence, again, it's the individual countries that matter in the end. And then Coda, so this is my final slide. The precipice of a trillion moment. Churchill is one guy I think we need to take a look at, and one of the things that kind of worries me in the day that we live in presently is that we want historical leaders to be perfect. And if there's anything wrong with them, if they made a wrong statement about gender or race, then they're no good, right? They're tarnished. But I think that you cannot measure a man or a leader in that manner. It's how they stood up or rescued the nation in times of a dire need, in times of crisis. And I think Churchill is one of those few leaders who really realized the threat. And one of the things that I have in mind is the 1930s. I mean, a lot of British elites were enamored with Hitler. They thought he was the greatest thing. But Churchill was like, no. I mean, Germany is dangerous. They're going to wreck our peace. But, of course, he was in the minority. He advocated taking stronger action towards Hitler's Germany. And, of course, is labeled a warmonger. So, and I think that's understandable because democracies, well, first of all, we value human lives, right? So we don't go to war hastily. But that also means we're very slow to react to crises. Reverting to war to save lives in the future is not something that any democratic leader can do. It's just the legitimacy and whatnot. And so the story will be the same this time around as well. I believe that we'll be forced into action only when our values are truly threatened. That's how it works. But I really am looking for a Churchill of today. I don't see any. I see lots of Chamberlains, especially in Japan. It's definitely full of Chamberlains. But I'm sort of betting that there could be a decisive change in 2025, where the threat will be much more transparent. That we will all realize, okay, it's not business as usual. The reason why 2025 is, well, China will be much more formidable in 2025, but also because I think Biden is a very cautious and a prudent leader, and I don't think he's the kind of guy who wants to pick a fight with China, that doesn't want to take that ultimate step. But maybe the leader after him, who will probably be most likely younger, will see things more in the long term, and may take the difficult decisions to preserve our way of life. But as it now stands, we abandoned Hong Kong. I refer to Hong Kong as the Asian Sudetenland. Remember, we all know what happened in Sudetenland. And the attitude towards Hong Kong is maybe not so much in Europe, but at least here, it's not a problem. I mean, of course, I shouldn't generalize, but it doesn't resonate too strongly with my students. When I talk to Japanese businessmen, they're like, oh my gosh, we're making lots of money in Hong Kong. All these companies are entering into the Chinese stock market to help them underwrite, whatnot, to help them list. lots of money there. So I mean, obviously Hong Kong is not the moment in which there'll be the ultimate push. But I think Taiwan is totally different. Again, I bring out the Poland, the 1939 analogy. I think this will definitely be China's Rubicon. And there are, of course, scholars that disagree with me. There are some scholars who say, no, America's not going to defend Taiwan. But I just don't see it. I just don't see a situation where America would abandon Taiwan. And again, if China makes the miscalculation and says, okay, if it's quick and decisive and we take Taiwan, before America can blink, then it's all over. Well, I think that's a serious mistake. And finally, I think we should never take peace for granted, and then assume that war is unimaginable. I think when we look at human history, I mean, it's our history. Conflict is our history. I have a friend, an anthropologist, says, the reason why we survived as Homo sapiens is because we were so violent. We exterminated all the Neanderthals. And so maybe it's part of our DNA. The strongest. Survival of the strongest. So then the big question is, how much faith do you have in humanity, and also how many faith do you have in the Chinese leadership? And is what really worries me at this point. Call me, a worry bug. Call me, alarmist. But that's how I see it. When I was in Denmark, 2008, 2009, I was called, what was I called? I was called, anti-Chinese so-and-so, okay? But situations change. And I think I've been proven correct that no, we cannot take China lightly. It's not going to be like another democracy. It's not, we're looking at the facts. And finally, just yesterday, an article that I wrote was posted. So, if you would like to sort of refer to some of this, especially about Taiwan, which mentions Taiwan, please go to the site. The easiest way to do it is just write Global Taiwan Brief and then put my last name in. It'll be one of the first things that pops up on Google. So with that, I spoke for about 50 minutes. I don't know what grade I get for my poor Portuguese, but I'm grateful for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Toshminoara, for this excellent and stimulating presentation. We are now opening the Q&A period. And I please ask to all the participants to open your videos to see us face-to-face, making the scenario more appealing than just pictures and names.
Yeah, it's good to see faces. Definitely.
Thank you. So, please, your questions. I don't know if Professor Carlos Gaspar would like to say the first words, comments, and questions. Carlos?
Yes, first of all, many thanks to Professor Toshminoara. My first point is that I hope he's wrong, and that Hong Kong is not the Sudetenland, but rather the reoccupation of the Rhineland. So we still have a little time before the push comes to shove. I think that is right in stressing the issue of Taiwan. In the last number of The Economist, an important journal in Europe, you have Taiwan on the cover, and it says something that most of us have been saying for a long time, is that Taiwan is the most dangerous place in the world. So you see a shift in the perception of the threats in Asia moving on. You have noticed that there was a French submarine going through the Formosa Straits very recently, and it seems that the United Kingdom has a new carrier, and it's going to Japan for a visit.
Yeah, the Queen Elizabeth, I think.
I don't know if it will have the impact of Commodore Perry's trip, but it's still a sign. it's still a sign that things are changing in Europe vis-a-vis the Asian theater and our partners in Asia, namely, of course, Japan. I have two questions for you. First one is, what are the obligations of Japan under the bilateral treaty with the United States vis-a-vis Taiwan? If there is an escalation, a military escalation in the Taiwan Strait, what are Japan's obligations? You said, and I agree with you, that it's almost impossible to imagine that the United States would do nothing, at least in the next few years, if there is a serious threat of invasion of Taiwan. But what will Japan do? What is Japan supposed to do? What is your planning on the case of an escalation in the Taiwan Straits? My second question is about India. You did not talk about India at all. Of course, you talked about the Quad, and there is India and the shared concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific. But I think that one of the most important shifts in the Asian balance is the rapprochement between Japan and India. I mean, the bilateral rapprochement between Japan and India, whether it's within the Quad coalition or dialogue, or if it is a bilateral relationship, a bilateral security relationship between Japan and India, and also between Japan, Australia, and India. I would very much like you to comment on this new reality of Asian politics. Thank you.
Okay, no, may I answer that, Dr. Tomei?
Yeah, Tash, please.
Okay,
Go ahead.
well, thank you very much for two fine questions. Regarding your first question, what will Japan do in a contingency? Well, that's classified, so I can't talk about it. No, I'm just kidding. I don't have any classified information. So this is my assumption, okay? And the assumption is that it depends on a lot of variables. I would assume that if Chinese try to take Taiwan, that they will have to, it's not going to be across the straits. I mean, there's going to be some kind of diversionary move on the straits, but what's important is the soft underside of Taiwan. That's the Pacific side. Actually, that's where a lot of the major bases are. So China will need to hold these assets, and so it needs to come around. But as you know, if you've been to Taiwan, the mountain range in the center of Taiwan is very, very tall, right? 4,000 meters. So it's very difficult for the Chinese radars to look on the other side. And this is where the importance of Senkakus comes. By taking Senkakus and establishing a radar base there, you can totally see what's going on. And so it's for me, and it's also another way to sort of stop the Americans from coming down from Okinawa. So in that case, if China does take Senkakus, that's Japanese sovereign territory there. So Japan can do pretty much whatever it needs to do. But if China does not want to risk that and does not take Senkakus, but only attacks Taiwan, then it gets kind of messy. Under the current agreement, most likely Japan will decide that this is a critical issue, and therefore Japan will assist in supporting the United States logistically and whatnot, but will not be on the front lines. So that's distinction. Is it Japan being under attack, or is it just Taiwan? Now, if the US is attacked, that falls in between, or Japan will do a lot more than just helping out the logistics, but it won't be, the full kitchen sink. So it really depends on what kind of contingencies. And I'm sure the Japanese military here, I want to tread cautiously because there are experts in this crowd who know a heck of a lot more than I do of the actual military planning that's going on. But what they've been whispering to me is that the public only knows a small percentage of what's actually going on. And there's lots of planning. So hopefully this planning will actually pan out when it's necessary. And your other question about Japan and India relations, I mean, India is, I go to India a lot. I love India, love many Indian friends, but on average, I don't think Indians are at the point where they realize, we have to lead the world. The United States will still be important, but it's not the United States. I'm repeating myself. It's not the United States in the 1950s. It's not that ever dominant. So here, this is our partner, and together with the United States, we're going to lead the free, democratic world. But that mentality is still not there. And I asked my Indian friends, I'm like, how come you don't want to lead? Don't you? Isn't there responsibility? And we're, this largest democracy, all that. And they're like, no, we did try to lead. It was called the non-aligned movement, and it never went anywhere. And so I think there's that trauma. There's also the trauma of the War of 1962, and so India's treading cautiously. So I think it does not want to put its eggs all in one basket. So you still have Quad, yet I think Indians are very careful not to push the Chinese too far. So India is about India. And it probably will be for the next decade for sure, where it pursues its own narrow self-interest. So it's not about a common agenda, a common goal. And that's why I said Quad was, same bed, different dreams. You have Australia picking a fight with China. You have the United States that's sort of backing up Australia. You have Japan that's a lot more cautious. And then you have India further on the other side where, India's a country that procures its weapons from its missile system from Russia. And so it's not just about the United States too. When you look at the four countries, India is with its relationship with the United States is not as deep as Australia and Japan. That's very clear. So there are a lot of distinctions there. Ideally, Quad should be like the ABCD encirclement, but we are also reliant on China for economic interest. That leads to pain, economic pain. And at this point, a lot of people don't want to do this. Japanese diplomats are very clear. Senior diplomats are saying, well, why start a fight with China when we need China, right? So it's a difficult path. I wish Japan were located on the Iberian Peninsula because things would be a lot more simple. But Japan's neighborhood is not like your part of the world. We haven't talked about North Korea, but North Korea is still there, and they have a lot more nuclear weapons than several years ago. And I'm sure, because the Biden policy is not to enter into negotiation without denuclearization first. This is a no-go. So they are going to be continue to be bad boys. Now, in a contingency with China, I think it's also important to realize that most likely Russia will move too. And Russia's objective will most likely be to pin down European forces. Okay, they're not going to strike Europe, but they're going to make sure that you're on your toes. And in that way, they can help China indirectly. So, again, like you said, Dr. Gaspar, I'm hoping I'm wrong, but I think there's never any harm in pondering or preparing for the contingencies. I'd rather be prepared for a fire by having an extinguisher and doing drills rather than being caught with my pants down without an extinguisher, right? So I think these are really serious issues that we need to address. But thank you again for really excellent questions.
I agree with you. May I ask you a favor? I think
Yes.
that my students in Portugal do not know what is the American, British, China, Dutch encirclement, the ABCD.
Oh, okay.
You're an historian. Can you share your wisdom with us?
Yeah, it's like the was it Operation Anaconda, the Civil War? Yeah, it's basically to not allow, it's a trade embargo to strangle Japan economically. And it was called ABCD. It was America, Britain, China. China was on the good side back then, and you had Netherlands, the Dutch. It sounds a lot better than Quad. And again, Quad really is not there to strangle China, because you can't strangle something that's that large. You know, you can't wrap your hands around its neck. But I think Quad could have meaning by expanding it. You know, again, I think Philippines and Korea and Vietnam and Indonesia, in my mind, are critical just because of the mass and because, you know, where they're located geographically. Now, the problem here is I mentioned Vietnam, and one of the things that I worry is with a democratic administration, human rights is very important. And I'm not saying that human rights is not important. I think it's critically important. Although I do see the irony in what's going on in the United States with, you know, Black lives being, you know, I don't see human rights there. But nevertheless, it's an issue that's really important. But if you press this too far, there is a possibility of alienating friends, or, you know, Vietnam. You know, they don't receive 5 stars in area human rights at all, right? So if you start pressing this, it gets kind of messy. You know, after all, you know, the Allies did shake hands with Stalin to get rid of Hitler, and I'm not saying that Vietnam is Soviet Union, but I think sometimes you need to be flexible. You need to you got to look at the rallies on the ground and create leeway so that you can work with countries that perhaps don't share certain values, but yet share a common threat. And this is something that I sort of worry. My friends in Vietnam telling me that the Vietnamese leadership they're really wary too. You know, after all, you know, China is their communist brothers, and even though they don't like each other, you know, if human rights becomes too prominent on American foreign policy agenda, then, you know, Vietnam will have to sort of watch how it proceeds. So, yeah, so there's all these things. Sometimes when American foreign policy gets too principled, too ideological, there can be problems.
Thank you, Tosh. You have a question at the Zoom chat from Nelson. What are the red lines Japan won't cross in the effort to restrain China? This is a question from Nelson.
What are the red lines Japan won't cross in an effort to restrain China? Well, I think I mean, Japan is not going to act unilaterally, right? And Japan is not going to act with force. So I think these are, I mean, these aren't even red lines. These are like, you know, no-goes. You know, you sort of see how Japan is proceeding. Now, have you noticed the rhetoric of Japan when it's with the United States? You know, 2+2, either the summit statement. You know, Japan is more forceful. It actually names China. Okay, even when as far as to saying Taiwan Straits, which is not the same as saying Taiwan, but yeah, you know, I mean, the word Taiwan was in there. But when Japan goes solo and makes statements, it doesn't even name China. All right, and one of the bills that's being right now discussed in the Japanese Diet, and it's about, you know, the Uyghurs. It's not going to name China. It's going to be this very general, oh, human rights, that's important, you know. And so there's a stark difference. So yeah, that's another, I think, obstacle when it comes to Japan, that it will act boldly when with the United States, but will be a lot more timid when it's not. So, you know, again, Japan needs to pursue its national interests as well. And so I can see the logic behind it, but I'm wondering if that's the wise course to pursue. You have to make a decision, and, you know, and I think eventually, sooner than later, Japan will have to make a decision of, is it economic interest or is it national security interest? And if you can't have both, then what do you choose? You know, that's it. But, you know, what's really interesting is I've been following a lot of articles written by Chinese experts in Japan. And this is really surprising, but a vast majority of these so-called experts of Taiwan This is their conclusion, that the game is over. The Chinese will surpass the United States, and the US can't do anything about it. It's game over. So wake up, smell the coffee. Okay, so if you're pursuing Japanese interests, you must foresee a world in which the United States is no longer dominant. So they're advocating a policy where Japan needs to enter into the orbit of China. And that really blows my mind. I mean, as Europeans, what do you think? I think that their assumption is completely incorrect. America is not going to just keel over and show its underside and say, "Oh, I give up." I don't think that's going to happen. So I think those conclusions are incorrect. But the fact that that they're espousing these views, to me, is worrisome. It really, it's really kind of sad. It really showed disrespect to our military institutions here in Japan, because it means just give up, right? So, okay. So, any other questions?
Yeah, I have my own question. I see no other questions.
Well, Dr. Tome, you always ask the tough questions, so I don't know.
No. but I like to hear your comments.
No, I'm just teasing. Please go ahead.
On the so-called EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
You know my position, but I'd like to hear.
Yeah. So I think like I said, you know how it's 27 assorted flavors, right? So I think any EU statement, I think the EU is a bureaucratic nightmare. It's amazing how they pull anything off. And especially when something that has to do with security or geostrategic issues. What you're going to have is a pretty watered down, in a way, a document that's just full of symbolisms more than anything else. Because all these European countries in the EU are not on the same page. They perceive China differently. For example, how does an average Portuguese perceive the China threat? And I was just speaking with a Portuguese in Tokyo just last week, and he was saying, well, to be really frank with you, not so much. It's different than some other parts of Europe. And so if you have this gap within your individual, national discourse, then of course, whatever is created by the EU won't have that much impact. It won't, it will lack teeth, is what I think. But then again, Louis, you're the expert. So, what do you think? Maybe the EU, so I think we need to look more at NATO is what we need to do. Maybe, I don't think it's about, and the fact that EU has lost Britain, I think, again, from the security dimension, you lost the nuclear power, right? So that's pretty significant. My friends in the Baltics always like to raise that. It's like we lost a massive power, at least from European perspectives. So maybe we need to discuss more about links with NATO and any statements that NATO makes about the Indo-Pacific. And has there been any lately, Louis, from NATO about the Indo-Pacific?
Not so much.
Not so much.
Think about that.
Okay, so that was.
We are all waiting the summit in June.
Yeah, I can see that. And next year will be different. Again, the two elections that take place in Asia will have some significant ramifications. I think China will slowly start to feel that it's being strangled, just a little bit. And I think when it feels that, there will be a natural reaction. And so, these small little pushes will become shoving, and shoving will become slapping, and slapping will become, I don't know, maybe punching, right? Who knows?
Yeah. There is a question from Zuena Lopes in the chat. According to researchers focusing on the trade relations between Europe and Japan are now discovering they have a great deal in common, joining up to defend free trade, democracy, and the rule of law. Based on your experience, do you see the cooperation between Europe and Japan as a long-term trend?
Yeah, I really have to agree with that. I used to be a Pacific person. That means, I had this bifocal lens of the United States and Japan. And, as an expert of US-Japan relations, it was always the comparison of these two countries. But when I lived in Europe, I lived in Britain, I lived in the Netherlands, and I realized, it's really important to have this third view, that it's not the US and Japan comparison doesn't always necessarily work that well, because when you look at society, Japan is much closer to Europe, the healthcare system and how people perceive religion and guns and, the standard of living, it's not all about bling bling. I think Japan is closer to Europe in many ways, and plus the rich history. And so, yeah, I think Europe brings a lots of synergies to Japan. I'm hoping that, and at one point, Europe was all about China, but I'm hoping that Europe will sort of, redo its calculations and make and reach the conclusion that, okay, it's time to link more with Japan. And Japan does have lots to offer. It doesn't have the size and mass of China yet, but we're both like-minded countries, and that brings a lot to the table, I believe. So in the area of think technology is important. I mean, it's no longer about 5G, right? We lost in 5G. I mean, the game is 6G. Europe has, you guys have Ericsson and other European companies have all the technology. I mean, there's lots of technology there. Japanese companies are through making TV sets, but they do also have technologies, And so to bring together the knowledge, the know-how, I think I could really be a positive force for change. And I'm all for that. I personally really enjoy spending time in Europe. That's why I really want the vaccine, so I could travel and stop doing these online things and actually see people in person.
Okay, thank you, Professor Toshminoara, for this wonderful explanation and sharing your views. I'm now asking all the audience to give a huge applause, Zoom applause, using the reactions button in the Zoom bar below. Thank you also for the ambassador, Japanese ambassador in Lisbon, for being with us. And I'm just remembering you that we have another conference at 1:30 p.m. with the researcher Constantino Xavier.
You guys have a triple header today. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, you're invited to as well. But many thanks for this conference, Professor Toshminoara.
Oh, thank you. Obrigado.
It was great. We'll keep in touch.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to follow.
Thank you. The honor was all mine. Thank you, Luis. It was always great to see you.
Obrigado. Thank you. Bye.